somewhere deep inside the forgotten storage vaults of an old Charleston courthouse, beneath decades of mildew, collapsed shelving, and water-rotted record books, lies a single document that should never have been created at all. A birth certificate dated March 1847, recorded under the name of a woman called Celia. At first glance, it looks like any other plantation-era record: yellowed parchment, faint ink, routine signatures. But the physician's notes attached to it contain descriptions that defy every principle of pregnancy known in the 1840s or the present day, measurements that contradict the laws of human development, observations that no amount of outdated medical understanding could justify. These documents, once reviewed by Charleston's Medical Society, were quietly sealed away in 1849, hidden under classification and dust for more than a century. The three physicians involved abruptly abandoned their practices, leaving the state within months, their careers effectively erased. And the descendants of those who witnessed what happened passed down only one warning: do not speak of Celia, do not search for her story, do not ask questions that have no safe answers. Tonight, we open the case they tried to bury, not by appealing to superstition or myth, but by examining the written facts that terrified Charleston's most respected doctors into silence. Celia's story remains one of the most unsettling medical events ever documented, not because of rumors or night whispers, but because educated men wrote down what they saw, measured what they could not comprehend, and then fled from their own findings. To understand what happened, we must step back into Charleston of the 1840s, a place built on elegance and brutality in equal measure. A city where wealth dripped from the port docks, while enslaved people labored endlessly to fuel the illusion of refinement. Cotton, rice, and indigo brought fortunes to the planter elite, while the bodies of black men and women carried the weight of their prosperity. And within this world, Charleston's medical community thrived, producing treatises on tropical diseases and childbirth complications. Research extracted from the suffering of the enslaved, performed without consent in conditions that would haunt any modern mind. Into this setting entered a case so disturbing that not even these physicians, hardened by years of unethical experimentation, could find comfort in science. 12 miles northwest of the city sat the Hartwell Plantation, a mid-sized estate of roughly 300 acres worked by 42 enslaved people. Edmund Hartwell, the owner, inherited the property in 1839 and managed it with a cold, practical efficiency shaped by loss and bitterness. His wife, Margaret, had died in childbirth in 1842, leaving him childless and increasingly withdrawn from anything resembling compassion. The overseer, Thomas Gaines, a transplanted Virginian known for his cruelty, handled the day-to-day operations with the zeal of a man convinced brutality was a form of order. Celia, born on the plantation in 1826, was 20 years old when her life became the subject of sealed archives and whispered warnings. She worked primarily in the main house, cooking and cleaning since the death of Margaret Hartwell, and appeared in plantation ledgers only as a quiet, steady worker. Her world consisted of routines, chores, and the close-knit yet weary community of enslaved people around her, a community that included Samuel, a skilled blacksmith purchased from Savannah, and Ruth, an elderly midwife who had delivered more than 100 babies on southern plantations. Neither Celia nor anyone around her had any hint of the horror that was about to unfold. The enslaved quarters at Hartwell were arranged in 2 tight rows behind the main house, 12 small cabins that held several families each, airless in summer and freezing in winter. In this cramped environment, secrets rarely lasted long, and illnesses or pregnancies were noticed early by the community's experienced women. Yet through the entire winter of 1846, Celia showed no signs of anything unusual, not to Ruth, not to her fellow workers, not even to the indifferent eyes of Edmund or Gaines. No swelling, no morning sickness, no breast changes, no fatigue, nothing. Then, on the morning of March 18, 1847, the impossible occurred. Celia collapsed while carrying firewood into the main house, the logs scattering across the floor as she fell, clutching her abdomen in confusion and pain. Ruth was summoned, expecting a fainting spell or stomach illness. But the moment she examined Celia, the midwife recoiled, refusing to touch her further. "This ain't right," she reportedly told the others. "This ain't natural. Mr. Hartwell need a doctor." It was the first sign that something beyond logic had taken hold, and it would pull Charleston's physicians into a case they would spend their lives trying to forget. Dr. William Saunders arrived at the Hartwell plantation late in the afternoon, fully expecting to find a routine case, perhaps a hidden miscarriage, a fever, or the sort of abdominal distress that enslaved women were often forced to ignore until their bodies collapsed under strain. But the moment he laid eyes on Celia, he understood this was not a matter he could dismiss with a few medicines and a scolding. Her abdomen was grotesquely distended, tight as if stretched to the point of tearing, yet the skin bore none of the gradual thickening or discoloration he would expect in late pregnancy. More disturbing still, movement rippled visibly beneath her flesh, unmistakable, consistent, rhythmic. Dr. Saunders pressed his ear to her belly and recoiled when he heard a strong, unmistakable fetal heartbeat, as loud and clear as if amplified by the impossible tension of her skin. "How long has she been like this?" he demanded. Ruth and the other enslaved women insisted this had begun only that morning. Saunders wrote his first note. The patient presents advanced pregnancy despite an absence of any preceding signs and despite unanimous reports confirming no visible gestational progression prior to March 18th. This observation is incompatible with medical knowledge. Perplexed and increasingly unsettled, Dr. Saunders sent word to Charleston for reinforcements, requesting the presence of Dr. James Pritchard, a younger obstetrician known for his ambition and fascination with unusual cases. When Pritchard arrived the next morning, he conducted his own examination with the enthusiasm of a man certain he would uncover what an older physician had missed. But as he measured Celia's abdomen, listened to the fetus, and conducted a structural evaluation, his confidence faltered. Everything he observed mirrored Saunders's findings, a pregnancy appearing well into the third trimester with none of the physiological hallmarks that should have preceded it. Her breasts remained unchanged. Her body showed no signs of long-term weight gain, her gait had never shifted, and there was not a single witness who could recall seeing the slightest physical change over the preceding months. "This cannot be concealed pregnancy," Pritchard muttered, pacing the small room. "A woman cannot hide 8 months of development without the world noticing, much less her own physiology registering it." The two physicians reviewed their notes, unable to explain what lay before them. At Saunders's urging, the most respected physician in Charleston was summoned, Dr. Henry Strickland, an aging medical scholar whose reputation rested on decades of meticulous record-keeping and a scientific temperament unshaken by illness, death, or grotesque abnormalities. If anyone could rationalize this case, it would be him. Strickland arrived on March 22nd, inspected Celia with dispassionate precision, and then, unexpectedly, went silent. He remeasured her abdomen twice, his hand steady, but his expression tightening with each recalculation. When he listened to the fetal heartbeat, he sat back slowly, as if confronted with something that defied the very foundation of his knowledge. "By my assessment," he finally said, "this pregnancy is between 32 and 34 weeks. But you say she showed no signs until 3 days ago." Both younger doctors confirmed it. "Then this case," Strickland said quietly, "represents a contradiction to the natural laws of gestation." His journal entry that night was even more stark. Either this woman has deceived us all through methods beyond comprehension, or we are witnessing biological impossibility. I find myself leaning toward the latter despite every instinct protesting such a conclusion. The doctors debated their next steps, unsure whether to relocate Celia to Charleston for observation or remain at the plantation to avoid public curiosity. Edmund Hartwell, driven only by concern for his property value rather than medical precedent, refused to let them transport her. He did not want gossip, scrutiny, or the humiliation of having an enslaved woman create scandal around his name. So the doctors stayed, sleeping in the guest rooms, documenting Celia's condition with unnerving detail as her abdomen continued to expand at an impossible pace. By March 21st, Saunders recorded an increase of 4 inches in circumference, an acceleration no known pregnancy could produce. And still, Celia insisted she had been with no man, that nothing had happened in the months the doctors identified as the supposed conception period. The enslaved community corroborated her claim. Even Edmund, cold as he was, admitted he had not touched a woman since his wife's death. Something was happening inside Celia's body that none of them could explain, and as the hours passed, the physicians felt a growing dread that they had stumbled into a medical event that might rewrite the boundaries of human understanding, if it didn't destroy their reputations first. On the night of March 23, 1847, Celia's cries awakened the entire plantation. Labor had begun suddenly and violently, as though her body had reached its breaking point. Ruth hovered nearby but refused to do more than hand towels and water, insisting over and over, "I ain't touching what ain't meant to be touched." The physicians worked through the night, expecting monstrous complications, but the birth progressed strangely smoothly. After 14 hours of pain, effort, and whispered prayers, Celia delivered a baby girl. Large, yes, but not malformed, not grotesque, not visibly unnatural. She weighed 11 pounds, measured 23 inches, and cried with the robust lungs of a fully developed newborn. Yet by every medical estimate, she should have been 2 months premature. Pritchard stared at the infant with a hollow expression, whispering, "This is impossible." Strickland's notes echoed the sentiment. Either our earlier calculations were wrong, which cannot be, or this child developed at a rate inconsistent with the limits of human biology. Saunders wrote only one sentence that captured the truth they all felt but could not admit publicly: "The facts before us cannot coexist with accepted science." The aftermath of the birth brought no relief to the physicians who had witnessed the impossible. Edmund Hartwell, indifferent to the scientific horror unfolding in his home, simply named the infant Dina and ordered Celia back to work once she recovered. To him, the case was closed, a valuable new piece of property added to his ledger. But for Drs. Saunders, Pritchard, and Strickland, the real mystery had only begun. Their sealed report submitted to the Charleston Medical Society documented the inexplicable timeline, the contradictory measurements, the rapid expansion of Celia's abdomen, and the shocking fact that a child appearing fully developed had emerged from a pregnancy that revealed itself barely a week before delivery. The Society responded with a terse directive to preserve the documents quietly, warning the trio that public disclosure would bring ridicule and damage Charleston's medical reputation. The physicians accepted the order, but privately they felt the weight of something they could not name, an unease that settled into their bones as they returned to their daily routines. They had witnessed a biological contradiction, and though they sealed the report, the case refused to leave their minds. While the doctors wrestled with their silence, the enslaved community observed Dinah with increasing dread. According to Samuel, the literate blacksmith who secretly kept a journal, the child's development was not merely quick, it was unnerving. At 6 months, Dinah could sit upright without wobbling, pulling herself to her feet with a strength far beyond what her age allowed. By 8 months, she uttered her first words, not the babbled sounds of infancy, but clear, crisp speech that startled the women who tended her. "Ruth say the child learning too fast," Samuel recorded. "Say she seen something like it long ago and it didn't end right." What terrified them was not just Dinah's milestones, but the eerie quality of her presence. She rarely cried, and when she did, the sound was wrong, an echoing, off-pitch noise that set teeth on edge. At night, women claimed they heard strange vocalizations coming from Celia's cabin, sounds not belonging to any human infant. The fear grew quietly, unspoken during daylight hours, but pervasive in whispers after dark. Celia herself had changed dramatically since the birth, retreating into a silent, haunted existence. The other enslaved women watched her move through her days with a hollow, mechanical rhythm, performing her duties without warmth or emotion. She tended to Dinah only as necessary, feeding and cleaning the child without the tenderness expected of a new mother. When asked about the baby, Celia would avert her gaze and fall silent, as if acknowledging the truth aloud might awaken something best left sleeping. Ruth insisted Celia felt something the rest of them only sensed at a distance, an instinctive recognition that the child she birthed was not wholly hers, not fully natural, something that had occupied her body only to emerge into the world with its own unknown purpose. "She's scared of that baby, same as the rest of us," Samuel wrote. "Maybe more." The isolation deepened, widening the space between Celia and the community that had once stood at her side. Then came the incident that cemented the enslaved community's terror into certainty. In February 1848, when Dina was around 11 months old, a 15-year-old girl named Grace was assigned to watch her while Celia worked in the main house. Grace later told Ruth she had seen Dinah, who should barely have been walking, moving across the cabin floor with unnatural coordination, her steps deliberate, steady, almost adult-like. When the baby paused and looked directly at her, Grace felt something cold and ancient press against her chest, freezing her in place. "That child look at me like she looking through me," she whispered to Ruth afterward. "Like she know things no baby should know," Grace screamed, and fled the cabin, refusing to go near Dinah again. Word of the event spread quickly among the enslaved workers, and the small, simmering fear became a choking presence that none of them could ignore. Even those who dismissed superstition felt something uncanny emanating from the child. The tension reached a breaking point on September 3, 1848, when the new overseer, Thomas Gaines, staggered into the kitchen, drunk and furious after an argument with Edmund. Celia happened to be working near the hearth when Gaines began shouting, and when she did not respond quickly enough, he struck her across the face with the back of his hand, sending her crashing to the floor. Dina, barely 17 months old but developing like a child twice her age, witnessed the attack. What happened next was remembered by every enslaved worker who heard the exchange. The toddler walked toward Gaines with a cold, deliberate calm, looked up at him and said with chilling clarity, "You should not have done that." Gaines barked out a laugh, mocking her with slurred words, but when he met her eyes, something in his expression faltered. Witnesses later swore that Dina's gaze changed in that moment, became deeper, sharper, almost predatory. Gaines stumbled back as if struck by an invisible force, muttering curses before fleeing the room. No one touched Dina, but every person present felt a shift in the air, a trembling sense that something irreversible had happened. The next morning, the plantation awoke to screams as workers discovered Thomas Gaines dead in his bed. His body lay rigid, twisted into an expression of terror so profound it appeared carved into his muscles. Dr. Saunders, summoned at daybreak, conducted a brief examination and found no wounds, no signs of poisoning, no physical trauma. His internal examination only deepened the mystery. Gaines's heart had stopped suddenly, cleanly, without disease or blockage, as if some invisible hand had simply turned it off. The official cause of death was listed as natural failure, but the enslaved community knew better. They whispered the same sentence in every cabin that night. The child killed him. Not physically, not with weapons or hands, but with something else, some force or awareness none of them had words for. And in that moment, the quiet dread that had lingered since Dina's birth solidified into collective certainty. Something unnatural had come into their world, and death had followed in its wake. In the weeks following Gaines's death, the plantation moved under a suffocating tension that even Edmund Hartwell could not fully ignore, though he dismissed it as servant superstition whenever Fletcher, the newly hired overseer, mentioned the workers' fear. But while Edmund focused on productivity and order, the physicians who had once studied Celia's impossible pregnancy felt a familiar unease pulling them back toward Hartwell's land, as though the case refused to remain buried. When Dr. James Pritchard unexpectedly encountered Edmund at a Charleston gathering, he casually inquired about the child's condition, expecting nothing more than a polite update. Instead, Edmund proudly described Dina as a remarkable little creature, recounting her rapid growth, her advanced speech, and her unusual awareness. Pritchard felt the blood drain from his face as Edmund spoke, and within days he had written to Saunders and Strickland, urging a follow-up examination for the sake of scientific completeness and their own sanity. On November 12, 1848, the three physicians returned to the Hartwell plantation with measuring instruments, developmental charts, and the heavy dread of men who feared what they might confirm. Dinah, now only 20 months old, stood before them as a child who appeared nearly 4, tall, balanced, physically coordinated, and speaking with a poise that bordered on unsettling. Her vocabulary, sentence structure, and comprehension belonged to a mind far older than her small frame suggested. She did not behave like a precocious toddler eager for attention. She behaved like someone studying the room, analyzing faces, calculating responses. Pritchard attempted a simple test. "Do you remember me?" he asked. Dina looked at him with disturbingly calm eyes and replied, "Yes. You were curious before. You're more frightened now. Why? The words hung in the air, heavy, cold, precise, spoken not by instinct but by understanding. As the examination continued, the physician's unease deepened. Dina's reflexes were unnaturally sharp, her responses almost anticipatory, as if her mind registered stimuli faster than any human child should. When Strickland attempted to check her throat, she pulled away with surprising strength and said perfectly, "No, that hurts," not in a whine or cry, but in a firm, measured tone. Her eyes tracked every movement in the room with a focused intensity that made Dr. Saunders mutter under his breath, "She watches us like we're the ones on display." Even more disturbing than her intelligence was her awareness, the quiet, appraising way she seemed to grasp the social dynamics around her, understanding power, caution, and intent at a level no toddler should reach. And with every observation they recorded, the same truth echoed in their minds. Dinah was not slowing down. She was accelerating. When the examination concluded, Dr. Strickland pulled Edmund aside to speak frankly. He explained that Dina's development was unlike anything documented in medical science and that her cognitive growth might continue at a rate that defied natural limits. But Edmund, blinded by ownership and the promise of a valuable house servant, reacted with irritation. He waved off Strickland's concerns, insisting the child's intelligence made her an asset, not a threat. "Whatever curiosity she represents, she is still my property," he snapped, "and her unusual qualities only increase her worth." To Edmund, the situation required no introspection, only control, discipline, and future profit. The doctors left the plantation with their worries unanswered and their warnings ignored, carrying with them documentation that felt increasingly like evidence of something growing beyond their ability to comprehend. Their third sealed report, submitted to the Charleston Medical Society, contained the most direct language they had ever used. They wrote of a mind developing at unnatural speed, of a child whose awareness and reasoning abilities approached adult levels, of a trajectory that suggested she might soon surpass every known milestone of human development. They expressed fear, genuine fear, about what Dina might become if her growth continued unchecked. The Society's response was swift and uncompromising. All reports and notes from the case were to be sealed indefinitely. No further examinations, no further discussion, no acknowledgement that such a phenomenon had ever occurred. For the first time, the Medical Society's tone carried not dismissal, but alarm. The message was clear. This case was too dangerous to exist in the public record. Silenced by professional decree, the physicians withdrew from the case. But the enslaved community had no such privilege. They lived with Dina's presence daily, feeling the tension rise like a storm barely held at bay. Workers requested reassignment to avoid Celia's cabin, inventing reasons to be far from the child. Fletcher responded with the whip, believing fear could be beaten out of them, but it only deepened the dread saturating every corner of the plantation. Samuel noted in his journal that even the air felt wrong when Dina was nearby, heavy, electric, as though some unseen force shifted when she walked through a room. Celia grew thinner, quieter, her face hollowed by fear and guilt she could not voice. She moved with the slow, resigned steps of someone who had been sentenced long before her death, someone who knew the future held only one outcome. As winter approached, the sense of impending disaster became impossible to ignore. Ruth watched Dina with wary eyes, whispering warnings the others did not want to hear. She murmured about another child she had once seen decades earlier, another birth that came wrong and ended in blood and drowning. She said Dina's presence felt the same, as if something ancient and merciless was wearing a child's body like clothing, learning human ways only to one day outgrow them. And Celia, hearing these words, did not argue. She did not deny. She simply stared into the night with a grief so deep it hollowed her from the inside. Everyone felt it now, the slow tightening of an invisible noose around the plantation. Something was building, gathering, waiting for its moment. And the moment would finally come on a cold February night in 1849, when the truth of Celia's fear would ignite into flames that consumed more than wood and flesh. They consumed the last chance anyone had to pretend Dina was merely a child. Winter settled over the Hartwell plantation with a heaviness that seemed to press down on every soul living there. The cold months were always hard, but this year the dread felt different, denser, suffocating, as though the air itself anticipated something terrible. Workers moved quietly, avoiding Celia's cabin even in daylight, whispering their fears only behind closed doors. Dina, now approaching 2 years old but looking closer to 4, navigated the grounds with a composed alertness that made grown men avert their eyes. She spoke rarely, but when she did, her words carried unsettling precision, as if each sentence had been formed only after quiet calculation. Samuel wrote that even the birds seemed to go silent when she walked past, and the dogs kept their distance as though sensing something unnatural beneath the child's skin. Celia, thinner by the week, drifted through her tasks like a woman rehearsing her final steps on earth. The community's fear deepened when Ruth finally revealed the secret she had been carrying for months. One night, as she and Samuel cleaned tools near the blacksmith shed, she confessed she had seen something like Dina once before, decades earlier on a sugar plantation deep in the south. She spoke in a low, trembling voice, describing a woman who had suddenly birthed a child that grew too fast, spoke too early, and possessed an unsettling intelligence that seemed to peer straight into a person's thoughts. The master of that plantation had tried selling the child, but every potential buyer refused after meeting it. When fear spread too far to contain, the mother drowned both herself and the child in the river, claiming it was the only way to spare the others from whatever the child would become. "I hoped I was wrong seeing it again," Ruth whispered, "but I ain't wrong. Celia's child is the same kind, something that shouldn't be here." Samuel wrote that her hands shook as she spoke, something he'd never seen in the sturdy midwife before. Celia herself seemed to confirm Ruth's fears without ever speaking them aloud. She avoided Dinah as much as possible, handing her to other women only when necessity forced her to interact. At night, she was heard whispering prayers with a desperation that bordered on madness, begging for forgiveness, begging for strength, begging for an end. "She already dead inside," Ruth told Samuel after watching Celia one morning, "just waiting for her body to follow." The enslaved community feared for Celia but feared Dina more. They could not shake the sense that the child was watching them, not with curiosity, but with a cold, analytical patience, as if learning their patterns and weaknesses. When the workers gathered by the fire at night, they spoke of omens, unexplained chills, unease that came without reason, shadows that felt too heavy. They all sensed something approaching, though none could articulate what. Edmund Hartwell remained oblivious to the growing terror among his enslaved laborers. He chalked up their tension to winter hardship and disobedience, ordering Fletcher to be more forceful with discipline. Fletcher responded with violence. Confident cruelty was a cure for fear. But each crack of the whip only amplified the dread. Dina watched these punishments without flinching, her eyes fixed on the overseer with an expression too calm for a child. Fletcher later admitted to Edmund that the girl made him uneasy, though he laughed it off as foolishness. Still, he avoided meeting her gaze when possible, as though some instinct warned him not to stare too long. Meanwhile, the tension on the plantation tightened like a rope pulling inch by inch toward a breaking point. Workers moved more quickly, spoke more quietly, slept less, and prayed more. Something in the air felt like the last breath before a storm. That storm arrived on the night of February 23, 1849, when the enslaved quarters erupted into chaos. Screams tore through the cold night as flames burst from Celia's cabin, climbing the walls with unnatural speed despite the damp winter air. The fire spread too quickly, too hungrily, as though fueled by something more than oil and wood. Fletcher and several men rushed to form a bucket line, but the heat drove them back each time they approached. When the cabin's roof collapsed in a shower of sparks, more cries echoed from the nearby cabins, not of fear, but of despair. They all knew who was inside. Celia had not tried to run. Dina had not cried out. They had burned in silence as the flames devoured everything around them. By dawn, all that remained was a blackened skeleton of the structure and the heavy scent of smoke woven into the air. Dr. Saunders was summoned at first light to examine the remains, though the moment he arrived he knew this case would trouble him for the rest of his life. Among the ashes lay 2 bodies, one adult, one small, burned beyond recognition but clearly positioned beside one another, as though placed intentionally. More disturbing was the discovery that the cabin door had been barricaded from the inside with furniture pushed against it. Oil lamps lay shattered across the floor in patterns that suggested deliberate placement, not accident. Saunders noted in his report that Celia's body appeared reclined, almost peaceful, as if she had accepted her fate long before the flames reached her. The child's body lay curled beside hers in a pose that struck Saunders with unexpected grief. But beneath that sorrow was another emotion he dared not write: relief. A sense that something dangerous had been halted just before it could grow into something far worse. To protect themselves, the enslaved community offered Fletcher only a carefully constructed story. They claimed Celia's mind had been troubled for months, that she must have knocked over a lamp in confusion, that the fire had been a tragic accident. Ruth spoke the lie aloud, a sacrifice that kept suspicion away from those who knew the truth. But privately, Samuel wrote the words none of them dared say openly. Celia did what had to be done. She saved us. She gave her own life to stop what her child was becoming. The fear that had suffocated the plantation for 2 years lifted in a single night, replaced by grief but also quiet gratitude. For the first time, the air felt still instead of tense, as though a dark presence had finally left. They mourned Celia, but they did not mourn the child. When news of the fire reached Charleston, the 3 physicians who had once documented Celia's impossible pregnancy read the brief newspaper notice with a heaviness they could not voice. None of the articles mentioned the child, of course, not her accelerated development, not her unsettling intelligence, not the sealed reports the medical society had locked away, but each doctor knew exactly what the brief headline implied. The end had come, and it had come in flames. They met privately one final time, sitting in Strickland's dimly lit study, each man silently confronting the truth they had tried to bury beneath logic. Pritchard broke the silence first, whispering, "Perhaps it is better this way. We witnessed something that should not exist." Strickland stared into the fire, his hands trembling slightly as he murmured, "But if it happened once, it can happen again. We sealed the records, not the phenomenon." Saunders, older and wearier, simply closed his eyes and said, "Some knowledge is too dangerous to chase. We were right to let it die with her." Within months, all 3 physicians abandoned Charleston, each man forever altered by the case they had tried to explain, then suppress. Pritchard relocated to Philadelphia, where he shifted his work toward conventional obstetrics, refusing to discuss his southern years with colleagues. Saunders retired to his family estate in Virginia, avoiding medical practice entirely and spending his remaining years in quiet isolation. Strickland withdrew from public life altogether, claiming failing health, though those who knew him believed the strain of Celia's case had broken something inside him. Not one of them ever spoke publicly about the child again, nor did they attempt to reopen the sealed documents. Their silence was not born from forgetfulness, but from a fear that lingered long after they left Charleston. The fear that they had witnessed the beginning of something nature had not intended to create. On the plantation, life lurched forward with the grim momentum of survival. Fletcher, unable to find proof of conspiracy, closed his investigation with a shrug and a few more lashes to assert dominance. Edmund Hartwell lamented only the loss of property, Celia's labor, Dina's potential value, and quickly refocused on rebuilding his workforce. Yet even he could not ignore the unease that clung to the plantation like a shadow. Workers moved differently now, lighter, relieved, but with a haunted reverence for the woman who had chosen fire over allowing something unnatural to continue growing. Samuel wrote that for the first time in years, he saw the enslaved community sleep through the night without waking in terror. The oppressive tension that had hung over them since Dina's birth lifted as though an invisible weight had finally been removed. But the memory of what they had lived through would never fully leave them. Years later, Samuel would escape during the chaos of the Civil War and travel north, carrying with him the journal he had kept in secret for more than a decade. Those pages became the only first-hand account from the enslaved people who had witnessed Dinah's birth, growth, and the fear she inspired. Generations later, his descendants would find the journal tucked inside an old wooden box, its entries faded but hauntingly clear. His words painted a picture the official records never dared acknowledge, a picture of a mother consumed by dread, a child developing at a terrifying pace, and a community caught between superstition and survival. Historians would later call Samuel's journal an invaluable artifact, though many scholars quietly admitted it unsettled them too deeply to read more than once. The Hartwell plantation itself would not survive long after Edmund's death in 1864. Sherman's march tore through the region, scattering records, burning estates, and reshaping the South. The property was eventually divided, sold, and built upon. Streets replaced fields, new homes replaced cabins, and the exact location of Celia's burnt remains vanished under the weight of progress. Today, no marker stands to remember her or the child she brought into the world. No signpost, no memorial, no plaque acknowledging the terror she endured. The land absorbed its own history, burying its darkest secret beneath foundations and asphalt, leaving only the sealed reports in Charleston's archives and the pages of Samuel's journal to hint at what once occurred. So what was Dina? A rare, undocumented medical anomaly, an accelerated growth condition science has not yet explained. A tragic misinterpretation of trauma by physicians unfamiliar with the complexities of enslaved women's health. Or was Celia right when she whispered that something had used her body to enter the world, something wearing the form of a child but not bound by human limits? And what of Gaines's death? The heart that stopped without cause, the terror frozen on his face. Coincidence? Stress? Or a glimpse of a force the enslaved community instinctively recognized but the physicians refused to name? These questions linger, suspended between fact and the unimaginable. In the end, the truth of Celia's story died with her in the flames that February night. The doctors fled, the archives sealed the evidence, and history did what it always does with unsettling truths, buried them beneath more comfortable narratives. But the documents remain, the measurements remain, the timelines remain, and the whispers remain. A pregnancy that appeared fully developed within days. A child who aged twice as fast as nature allowed. A mother who chose death over letting that child grow into whatever it was becoming. Some mysteries are not forgotten because they are unsolved. They are forgotten because those who saw the truth feared what it meant for the world. So now I ask you, what do you think truly happened on the Hartwell plantation? Was Celia an unstable mother driven by terror and grief? Or did she perceive something real that the physicians, despite all their training, could not fully see? Leave your theories below. And if stories like this, stories buried, silenced, and hidden, captivate you, make sure you subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves dark mysteries that challenge everything we think we know about history. Because the past does not always stay quiet. Some stories wait patiently in the shadows, sealed away until someone is brave enough to open the file.